This is not really a story about a dam that broke. It is a story about the space between warning and proof, and about who pays when a city is forced to wait for certainty. The first warning was not a wave, it was a crack, a thin line in the outer face of a new dam, high above Sheffield, while the reservoir behind it was being filled for the first time. At first, the crack looked almost harmless. One account said it was only wide enough for a penknife, but it ran for roughly 50 yards across the embankment, and behind that embankment sat more than 100 million cubic feet of water. By midnight, the crack had become a gap. The gap became a breach, and a reservoir built to feed a growing industrial city became the thing that entered the city while most people were asleep. The official record counted 240 drowned. It counted 100 buildings and 15 bridges destroyed. It counted around 4,000 houses flooded. In the valley below the new dam lived workers, mill hands, shopkeepers, families, and children. Most of them slept that night without knowing that the reservoir above them was running its first real test. The Sheffield Flood Claims Archive would later record 116 separate losses of life, one per claim, one per name. None of those names appeared in any warning before the water reached them. But those numbers are not the strangest part of the Sheffield flood. The strangest part is that the dam did not fail in old age. It failed at the beginning. Dale Dyke was new. Its water was new. Its pressure was new. And the first full test of the structure happened not in a laboratory, not in a controlled inspection, but on a stormy March night with Sheffield below it. The question is not simply why the dam broke. The record never gives a single clean answer. The question is how a crack nobody could explain became a warning that arrived too late to matter. In the middle of the 19th century, Sheffield was growing faster than its water supply. In 1801, the town had fewer than 50,000 people. By 1861, it had more than 185,000. Steel, cutlery, grinding wheels, mills, workshops, and crowded housing had filled the valleys. Water was not only domestic comfort, it was industry, it was public health, it was power. The Sheffield Waterworks Company already supplied the town from smaller reservoirs, but Sheffield needed more. So the company turned to the hills northwest of the city, around Bradfield and the Loxley Valley. The plan was ambitious. A group of reservoirs would collect clean upland water and send it toward the expanding town. Dale Dyke, also called Bradfield Reservoir in contemporary accounts, was one of them. It was an earth embankment dam across the Dale Dyke stream. The structure was roughly 500 feet wide at the base and about 95 to 100 feet high. Behind it, the valley would become a reservoir about a mile long. To a Victorian engineer, this was not fantasy. It was progress made visible. An industrial city needed water, and the hills could provide it. But a reservoir is not just a lake. It is a stored force. And a new dam is not proven because it stands. It is proven only when the water rises against it. That is the first uncomfortable fact in this story. The danger was not hidden. It was waiting for the dam to be asked a question. At the center of the Dale Dyke embankment was a puddle-clay-core, a narrow waterproof wall intended to stop water passing through the dam. Below it was a trench cut down into the foundation. The idea was simple enough. Carry the waterproof barrier down until it met ground that could hold it. But the ground was not simple. At the inquest, the consulting engineer, John Towlerton Leather, described soil, clay, stone, shale, and coal measures. The original plan had expected a much shallower trench. Instead, the builders had to go deeper. In places, the trench went down about 60 feet before a satisfactory foundation was reached. Water entered the trench during construction. It had to be pumped. The work continued. The wall rose. The embankment took shape. To the people building it, these were problems to solve. To the record we read now, they are signals, not proof of one cause, not a solved mystery. Signals that the foundation, the clay wall, the pipes, the water, and the valley were all part of one system. I read the inquiry material as a record of confidence meeting ground it did not fully understand. The men involved could describe the parts. They could not prove how those parts would behave together under a full reservoir. By 1863, the dam and its works had been passed as satisfactory. It was allowed to fill. That phrase matters. Allowed to fill. Because filling a reservoir is not a passive act. It changes the weight on the foundation. It changes the pressure against the core. It changes the meaning of every small defect. On Friday, March 11, 1864, the reservoir was close to full. The weather was severe. A storm drove wind across the water and threw spray against the embankment. John Gunson, the resident engineer for the Waterworks Company, visited the dam in the afternoon. According to Harrison's contemporary account, he arrived around 3 o'clock. The water was only inches below the level of the weir. He examined the dam, saw the waves, and returned to Sheffield. Everything appeared safe. Then at about 5:30, a workman named William Horsfield crossed the embankment on his way home. The wind was strong enough that he did not walk across the exposed top. He moved along the side instead. There he saw the crack. It was narrow, but it was long. Horsfield thought it might be a frost crack. He told another workman. The message moved from person to person. By around 7 o'clock, men with lanterns were examining the embankment in the dark. This is the moment the episode turns. The crack was no longer invisible, but it was still interpretable. A crack can be a surface mark. A crack can be settlement. A crack can be frost. A crack can be the first visible sentence of a failure already moving inside the dam. The problem was that nobody at the dam could know which one it was quickly enough. The men opened the outlet pipes to lower the water. That sounds decisive, but the pipes could not empty the reservoir quickly. At the inquest, the rate discussed implied days, not minutes. The reservoir was not a kettle that could be poured out once the handle became too hot, and there was no general warning sent down the valley. Some people near Bradfield heard, some in Dam Flask heard by accident when the messenger's horse needed attention, but Harrison's account is explicit on the larger point. No one was sent broadly down the valley to warn the people until the embankment was at the edge of failure, or had already failed. This was not because one man woke up and decided Sheffield did not matter. That is too easy. The more useful reading is colder. The system had no practiced language for a half-known warning. It had a crack. It had opinions about the crack. It had a messenger to fetch the engineer. It had pipes that lowered water slowly. It did not have a way to convert uncertainty into immediate public alarm. By the time Gunson received the message in Sheffield, it was between 8:30 and 9. He and the contractor set out for the reservoir. They traveled through the dark, up the Loxley Valley, through communities that did not yet know what was stored above them. At about 10 o'clock, they reached the dam. The crack had widened. Harrison describes it as wide enough to admit a man's hand. Still, the men at the site did not fully apprehend the danger. Gunson tried to reduce the pressure further. Gunpowder was brought to blow a channel in the weir. The attempt failed at first. This is the kind of detail that turns a disaster into a mechanism. The response was not nothing, but it was late, improvised, and small compared with the force already assembled behind the wall. The dam was not waiting for a perfect decision. It was moving. Gunson and Swindon went back to the crack with lanterns. They were trying to measure its relation to the water level. Then Gunson saw water foaming over the embankment, falling like a white sheet, and dropping into the crack. At that point, the mystery was over in one sense and beginning in another. The practical question was no longer whether the crack was dangerous. The practical question was whether any human action could still change the outcome. An opening appeared at the top of the embankment. Water rushed through. The center of the dam began to sink. Gunson and the others ran. A few minutes before midnight, Dale Dyke failed. The breach widened to roughly 110 yards at the top and about 70 feet deep. The reservoir released about 114 million cubic feet of water into the Loxley Valley. The Sheffield Flood Claims Archive gives another scale for the same force, about 650 million gallons, or around 3 million cubic meters, moving through the valley within an hour. Numbers like that can go numb, so put them on a map. The dam stood about 8 miles northwest of Sheffield. Below it were Bradfield, Dam Flask, Loxley, Malin Bridge, Hillsborough, Owlerton, Neepsend, the Wicker, and the industrial districts along the Don. This was not open country. It was a working valley. Mills, grinding wheels, workshops, warehouses, inns, rows of houses, small rooms near rivers, because work had always gathered near water. The same geography that made Sheffield productive made the flood efficient. The water did not need to find the city. The valley delivered it. At first, the flood moved through the upper valley. It tore at roads, bridges, trees, walls, mills, and homes. Then it gathered the valley's own materials into itself. Timber, stone, furniture, machinery, mud, and broken structures became part of the moving force. By the time it reached populated districts, it was no longer simply water, it was water carrying the valley with it. At Malin Bridge, the damage became concentrated. At Hillsborough, the flood met the Don. Further down, it entered the Wicker and the low parts of Sheffield. The Claims Archive states that the water reached 26 feet on the upper Loxley and still stood about 6 feet at Ladies Bridge in the center. That is the visual spine of the episode. A crack at the dam, a white line of water entering it, a breach, a valley becoming a channel, a city learning the level of the reservoir by the height of water in its streets. But the flood also has to be held at human scale. In the lower valley, Henry Porton was awakened by the noise and found water inside his house. Harrison records him opening a window and calling to nearby cottages. After the water subsided enough, he helped rescue neighbors from damaged houses and roofs. By the end of that sequence, several families and 3 babies were in his house. That detail matters because it does not make the night heroic in a cheap way. It shows the distance between official warning and actual survival. Once the dam failed, the rescue system was local, improvised, and immediate. People saved whoever they could reach. They did it in darkness. They did it after the warning system had already failed to arrive. In other places, there was no such chance. Harrison's account lists families drowned in houses, workers caught near mills, children lost in low rooms, and bodies carried far beyond the places where they had lived. The Sheffield City Council guide notes that records of the dead and missing were kept by the constabulary. The official number became 240, but even that number has a shadow. The Council Research Guide points out that later loss of life claims included people not on the official lists of the dead. That does not let us choose a dramatic new number. It does require us to say that 240 is the official count, not the entire moral boundary of the event. The record counted the disaster through offices that had to work quickly. The compensation system later found cases the official list had not fully absorbed. This is why the Sheffield flood should not be told only as a wall of water. It was also a record-making event. First, the city had to count the dead. Then it had to count the damage. Then it had to decide what the waterworks company owed. The claims process was enormous. The Sheffield Flood Claims Archive lists 6,724 claims for damage, 347 for injury, and 116 for loss of life. The total awarded was GBP 273,988. That is not just a financial footnote, it is the afterlife of the flood in ledger form. The valley had been treated as a place where water could be stored for the city. After the failure, the city had to turn every smashed wall, lost tool, drowned animal, damaged shop, injury, and death into a claim. The Board of Inundation Commissioners did not only arbitrate money, it translated ruin into categories. And categories always leave something outside. The technical question remained, why did the dam fail? Here the record becomes less cinematic and more important. There were theories. Some focused on the outlet pipes beneath the embankment, some focused on leakage and internal erosion, some focused on landslip. The government inspectors Robert Rawlinson and Nathaniel Beardmore were sent to Sheffield. The Geological Society's later summary says their report identified bad design and bad workmanship, but remained essentially inconclusive. Later research kept returning to the foundation and the core. Modern analysis associated with GM. Binney argued that the bedrock beneath the puddle wall created a sharp step, and that differential settlement could have cracked the core above that step. Other summaries also note the possibility of a powerful underground spring entering the puddle trench and rupturing its filling. The safe conclusion is not that one neat villain has been found. The safe conclusion is that the dam combines several forms of uncertainty in one structure. Difficult foundation conditions, a deep puddle trench, water during construction, pipes beneath the embankment, first filling, and a crack whose cause could not be established in time. I am willing to argue that the most revealing failure was not the final breach. It was the confidence that a new reservoir could be allowed to prove itself while a full valley lived below it. At the inquest, a sharper question surfaced. If the outlet pipes could take days to lower the reservoir, what emergency margin did the system really have? The coroner pressed the engineers on whether there should have been a better way to reduce danger once suspicion existed. The answer, in effect, was that the works had been built according to the assumptions of their makers. And that is the hard part. Disasters like this are often remembered as moments when assumptions suddenly break. But the assumptions were doing work long before the breach. The assumption that the foundation was understood well enough. The assumption that the puddle trench and core would behave as intended. The assumption that previous reservoirs justified confidence in the next one. The assumption that a crack could be watched before a valley had to be warned. The assumption that the first filling was a normal stage rather than the most dangerous test the dam would ever face. Dale Dyke did not fail because Victorians were foolish. That is a comforting version, and it is too simple. It failed in a world where engineering knowledge was advancing, cities were expanding, and private infrastructure companies were being asked to solve public problems at industrial speed. The dam was built to make Sheffield safer and healthier. That is part of the tragedy of the mechanism. The project existed because the city needed water, but the need for water also created pressure to build large works in valleys where failure would not remain local. The council guide notes that after the flood, the company remained liable through a special process of compensation. The Claims Archive shows how large that process became. The dam itself was later rebuilt on a smaller scale and further upstream. But rebuilding the dam did not answer the old crack completely. The official and technical record can explain much. It can describe the structure, it can locate the trench, it can list the claims, it can preserve the names, it can compare theories of failure. What it cannot give is the exact moment when uncertainty should have become alarm. That is where the episode lives. The work is to hold the contradiction without forcing it shut. The cause was never cleanly solved. The engineers were not villains, and the flood was exactly the size the sources allow it to be, which is large enough. A new dam stood above a growing city. The reservoir was nearly full for the first time. A crack appeared. The men at the dam tried to interpret it. The water interpreted it faster. By the time the breach opened, even a fast warning could not outrun the flood. Harrison records Rawlinson's later judgment that no horse could have carried warning fast enough after the dam burst. That line is often used to show the speed of the water. It also shows the failure of timing. If warning after the breach was impossible, then the only useful warning had to happen before certainty. That is the lesson institutions resist. They prefer certainty because certainty protects them from embarrassment. It gives them permission to act only when they can defend every reason. But in a reservoir valley, certainty can arrive as water through a crack. The Sheffield flood was not only a disaster of construction, it was a disaster of thresholds. What level of uncertainty justifies alarm? What visible defect requires public warning? What does an engineer owe to people who cannot see the structure above them? And who gets to decide whether a crack is harmless when the cost of being wrong belongs to the valley? Those questions did not drown with the houses. They survived in the reports, the claims, and the rebuilt dam. They are why the Sheffield flood still feels modern, not because we build the same dams in the same way, but because institutions still love the space between warning and proof. They use it to wait. They use it to narrow responsibility. They use it to say the evidence was not yet conclusive. Sometimes that caution is necessary. Sometimes it is discipline. But at Dale Dyke, the crack was not an abstract uncertainty. It was a physical line across a full reservoir above a city. The disaster did not begin when the water entered Sheffield. It began when the first full reservoir became the dam's first real test, and when the crack was treated as a problem, the dam could answer slowly. The record never completely explains the crack, but it explains the danger of needing the explanation first. By the time Sheffield saw the water, the question had already been answered.